Hi everyone. In this video, I want to show you step-by-step process of making this frame. As you can see, there are almost 200 pine cones encapsulated in Deep Pour Epoxy Resin. Because this picture frame is very large, 5.5 feet wide, the first thing I did was to make a steel reinforcing plate. I used leftover pieces of 16 gauge sheet metal. Then I added bends for stiffness using a magnetic press brake. You can find a video on my channel about this equipment if you are interested. Next step is making the mold. For the base I used 3/4 drywall instead of the recommended MDF board, and it worked without any problems. For the side walls of the mold, I used 3/8 plywood. Don't forget to create a recess in your future frame for your picture. After it's done, you need to tape the inside surface with a Tyvek sheathing tape to prevent the epoxy from sticking to the mold. You can lower the profile of pine cones by clipping off the bottom side. Pine cones need to be sealed with a water-based sealer to prevent air bubbles coming out of the porous wood. I would even recommend doing 2 coats of sealant based on my experience. When you're ready to cast, remember that epoxy needs to be poured at a certain room temperature. You can refer to the instruction of the resin you are using. Keep in mind that not only the resin, but also the mold must be at that temperature. The viscosity of the resin depends on this, which means its ability to flow, as well as the ability of air bubbles to come out. Since my workshop has no heating, I had to move the mold to the basement. Use silicone to seal all gaps in the mold. Once the epoxy starts to leak from the mold, it will be impossible to stop it. Be sure to clean the mold and level it before casting. It's not a bad idea to arrange the pine cones however you like so you don't waste time after the epoxy is mixed. Let's get dirty and mix the first batch of epoxy. I decided to make the bottom layer dark brown so that the reinforcing plate blends into it. At the same time, it will be like a background, otherwise you will see the drywall through a completely transparent picture frame. After the resin and hardener are mixed, you need to pour it into other buckets. This is to avoid using poorly mixed epoxy on the sides of the bucket. Therefore, when pouring into a new bucket, do not scrape off the walls to save every drop. Use a propane torch to remove air bubbles. Now is the time to lay down the pine cones, then wait a few hours for the epoxy to begin to set. I've tried a fancy heat gun that allows you to adjust both temperature and airflow. Even at the lowest airflow setting, it blows too hard. Therefore, I recommend a simple propane torch. Now I need to wait until the epoxy starts to set. Not only will this prevent the color layer from blending into the transparent layer, but it will also keep the pine cones from moving, much less floating when I pour over the main layer. When the epoxy is tacky, it's time to pour the clear coat. It's not a bad idea to let the epoxy sit for about 15 minutes after mixing to release some air bubbles. Gently pour in the epoxy, wait a few minutes, and begin to get rid of the rising air bubbles with a propane torch. The heat of the flame reduces the surface tension of the epoxy, allowing air bubbles to escape. Don't overheat. Avoid white smoke to start coming from the top surface of the epoxy. After the epoxy has completely cured, you can carefully disassemble the mold. Some pine cones intentionally stick out above the pour level. They will be sanded down and create a cool cutaway look. Now sand the entire picture frame using 220 grit sanding discs. Seal the exposed pine cone scales with 2 coats of wood sealer, and sand lightly by hand to make the final coat of epoxy adhere better. Use tabletop epoxy for the final layer. Spread the epoxy evenly using a notched or flat adhesive spreader. Remove air bubbles. Any drips at the bottom can be sanded after the epoxy is completely cured.